Imagine a man so powerful that the government of his own country had to beg him to go to prison. Not arrest him, not chase him, not threaten him, beg him. And when he finally agreed, he came with conditions. He would design the jail himself. He would hire his own guards. He would write the rules. And the Colombian police, they weren't allowed within 12 miles of the building. Inside this so-called prison, there was a soccer field, a bar stocked with imported liquor, a discotheque with flashing lights and music pumping through the night. Celebrities flew in to visit. Business meetings happened every single day. And 15 tons of cocaine kept moving into the United States without a single interruption. This was not a prison. This was a palace built on top of a mountain. And the most dangerous criminal in the history of the modern world was sitting inside it, untouched, unbroken, and completely in control. His name was Pablo Escobar, and this is not just the story of a drug lord. This is the story of how one man, born in poverty, raised in chaos, and consumed by an obsession with power, broke every institution, every law, and every government that dared to stand in his way. This is the story of how he built an empire worth $25 billion, how he controlled 80% of the world's cocaine, how he ordered the deaths of over 4,000 people, including judges, ministers, journalists, police officers, and presidential candidates. And this is the story of how it all ended, not with handcuffs, not with a trial, but with 3 bullets on a rooftop in Medellin, the city he terrorized, the city that loved him, and the city that ultimately swallowed him whole. December 1st, 1949. A small farming town called Rio Negro in the Antioquia region of Colombia. A school teacher named Ermilda and a farmer named Abel welcome their 3rd child into the world. They name him Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Nothing about this moment suggests anything extraordinary. No signs, no warnings. Just a baby boy born into a modest, working-class Colombian family. The kind of family that scrapes by, that hopes for better, that teaches their children to be honest and to work hard. When Pablo was still very young, the family moved to Medellin, Colombia's 2nd-largest city and, at the time, a city undergoing dramatic and painful transformation. On one side of Medellin were the wealthy neighborhoods, clean streets, tall buildings, private schools, and families who had everything. On the other side were the comunas, dense hillside slums where hundreds of thousands of people lived without reliable water, without sanitation, without opportunity, and without any real hope that tomorrow would be different from today. Pablo grew up watching both sides. He walked through streets where children begged for food within sight of mansions protected by iron gates. He saw what money meant in Colombia, not just comfort, but power, not just security, but immunity. The rich were untouchable. The poor were invisible. And something in Pablo Escobar refused to accept that. He was not a dull child. Teachers remembered him as sharp, curious, and unusually confident for someone his age. He could talk his way through almost any situation. He could read a room. He could figure out what people wanted and use that knowledge to his advantage. His early dreams were surprisingly ordinary. He talked about becoming a lawyer, then a politician, then, without any embarrassment, the president of Colombia. But those dreams required money. Money for school, money for connections, money that his family simply did not have. When the financial pressure became too great, Pablo had to leave school. The door that education might have opened closed. And in that moment of closure, something shifted inside him. The ambition didn't disappear, it didn't soften, it turned. He made himself a promise, the kind of promise that only a very young, very desperate, very determined person can make. He swore that by the age of 25, he would be a millionaire, and if he failed, he would end his own life. He was completely serious. Every word of it. Pablo Escobar's first crimes were embarrassingly small. Stolen tombstones from cemeteries, which he would resell after sanding off the inscriptions. Forged diplomas and fake academic certificates sold to people who wanted credentials they hadn't earned. Petty smuggling of electronics and consumer goods. These were the crimes of someone learning, testing limits, figuring out how the world worked. Not the official version taught in classrooms, but the real version. The one operating in the shadows beneath every city. His cousin and close companion, Gustavo Gaviria, was with him through these early years, and together they escalated quickly. Car theft became their primary business. They would steal vehicles, strip them down for parts, and sell everything separately. The profit margins were better than anything legitimate work could offer. But car theft had a ceiling, and Pablo was not built for ceilings. He moved into kidnapping. Not randomly, he was strategic about it. He targeted wealthy industrialists and businessmen, people who had assets, people whose families would pay to get them back. The operation was straightforward and brutal. Identify a target, grab them, make the demand, collect the money. But Pablo added something extra that distinguished him from ordinary kidnappers. He didn't always release his victims, even after the ransom was paid. In 1971, he kidnapped a wealthy industrialist named Diego Echevarria. The family met his demands. The money changed hands. And then Pablo killed Diego anyway. This was not irrational. This was a message, a deliberate, calculated message delivered to everyone watching. Pablo Escobar is not just another criminal trying to make money. He is something different, something that doesn't follow the expected rules, something that cannot be reasoned with or predicted. Fear, he had already understood, was more valuable than money. Fear was the currency that bought everything else. By the time Pablo was 22 years old, he had crossed the threshold he had set for himself. He was a millionaire, 3 years ahead of his own deadline. But somewhere along the way, the deadline had stopped mattering. Because Pablo had discovered something more intoxicating than reaching a goal. The feeling of having no limit at all. The 1970s transformed the Americas, and the substance driving that transformation was cocaine. Cocaine had existed for decades, but in the early 1970s it exploded into American popular culture with a force that nobody had anticipated. It moved from the fringes into the mainstream, into the music industry, into Hollywood, into Wall Street, into the discotheques of New York and Miami and Los Angeles. Suddenly, everyone wanted it, and the demand was growing faster than anyone could supply. For Colombian traffickers who already had connections to coca-producing regions in Peru and Bolivia, this was not a crisis. This was a gold rush. Pablo Escobar watched all of this with the same cold, calculating intelligence he had applied to every opportunity before. He saw the enormous gap between supply and demand. He saw the fortunes being made. He saw the routes being used, the weaknesses in law enforcement, the corruption that could be exploited at every level. He started by working for other traffickers, not because he lacked ambition, but because he was smart enough to learn before leading. He studied the supply chains. He mapped the smuggling routes. He built relationships with producers in Peru and Bolivia. He identified the corrupt officials who could be bought, the border agents who would look away, the pilots who would fly anything for the right price. He used extraordinary methods to move his product. Cocaine was packed into the spare tires of cars, hidden inside television sets, stuffed into the stomachs of fish, concealed inside condoms swallowed by human couriers, loaded into the landing gear of commercial aircraft. For every pilot willing to carry a shipment into the United States, Pablo paid $500,000 per flight. Not per kilogram, per flight. The pilots became the highest-paid criminals on the continent. By 1975, Pablo had learned everything he needed, and he had decided he was done working for other people. His first move was decisive and savage. He had the most powerful cocaine trafficker in Medellin, a man named Fabio Restrepo, assassinated. Then he gathered Restrepo's entire organization together and gave them one choice: work for me or join your former boss. Every single one of them chose to work for Pablo Escobar. Every single one of them chose to work for Pablo Escobar. He had his foundation. Now he was going to build something the world had never seen. 1976 was the year everything accelerated. Pablo Escobar formerly partnered with some of the most dangerous men in Colombia. The Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio, brought connections, resources, and legitimacy within certain criminal circles. Carlos later brought a revolutionary idea. Instead of smuggling cocaine in small quantities using human couriers, why not use private aircraft to move massive loads all at once? And Jose Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, brought muscle, ruthlessness, and a network of enforcers who could operate anywhere in the country. Together they created the Medellin cartel. Pablo Escobar was its undisputed head. Carlos later's aircraft idea transformed everything. The cartel purchased Norman's Key, a small island in the Bahamas, and turned it into a private cocaine hub. They built an airstrip over 1 kilometer long. They installed a refrigerated warehouse to store product. They stationed boats, planes, and armed guards. From Norman's Key, cocaine moved into Florida with an efficiency that was almost industrial. The proximity to the United States was the key. Colombia was thousands of miles away. Norman's Key was close enough to Florida that a small plane could make the trip quickly, at night, below radar coverage, and be back before dawn. Pablo also struck deals with smaller drug operations across Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. His offer was simple: run your product through my network, and I'll guarantee delivery or reimburse your losses. In exchange, I take a significant cut of everything. Most people accepted. Those who hesitated were given additional motivation. The results were staggering. Within a few years of its formation, the Medellin cartel was responsible for 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. Not 40%, not 60%, 80%. The money that began flowing into Medellin was so enormous that the city's economy was visibly distorted. Real estate prices shot up, cash flooded local businesses, and Pablo Escobar, a boy from the slums who had dropped out of school, found himself counting his weekly earnings not in millions, but in hundreds of millions. He was 30 years old. He was the most powerful drug trafficker on earth. And he was only getting started. Every empire needs a system of control. Pablo Escobar's system was 2 words: plata o plomo, silver or lead. The logic was breathtaking in its simplicity. You had 2 options: accept his silver, his bribe, his money, his protection, and you would prosper. Your salary would triple overnight. Your family would live comfortably. Your children would go to good schools. You would be taken care of, as long as you remained useful and loyal. Or you could choose lead, his bullet. And if you chose that path, if you refused his money, if you opposed him, if you tried to bring him down, then you would die. Not just you, your wife, your children, your parents, your brothers and sisters. Everyone connected to you would be erased. This was not a threat made in anger. It was a policy, stated calmly and enforced without exception. Judges who had ruled against his associates found their families kidnapped. Politicians who spoke out against the cartel were assassinated in their cars, on the steps of public buildings, in broad daylight. Journalists who investigated the cartel were shot at their desks. Police officers who pursued his men too aggressively were hunted down, and their families were targeted alongside them. Pablo actively paid bounties for dead policemen. He announced publicly, through intermediaries, that any criminal in Medellin who killed a police officer would receive a cash reward. The result was a surge of anti-police violence that paralyzed law enforcement in the city for years. Over 600 police officers would be killed because of Pablo Escobar's orders or incentives. The effect on Colombian institutions was catastrophic and long-lasting. The judicial system buckled. Prosecutors refused cases involving the cartel because the career trajectory for prosecutors who pursued those cases had only one endpoint: a coffin. Entire courtrooms functioned in a state of paralysis, unable to render verdicts, unable to enforce laws, unable to do the fundamental things that courts are supposed to do. Colombia was not simply a country with a drug problem. Colombia, by the mid-1980s, was a country where the most powerful institution was not the government, not the military, not the church, but a drug lord from Medellin who had imposed his own law on 12 million people. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. It was the most efficient system of governance Pablo Escobar ever devised. By the late 1980s, the Medellin cartel was generating revenue that defied comprehension. Pablo Escobar's personal earnings were estimated at $420 million per week. Per week! He was listed by Forbes magazine among the 7 wealthiest people on the entire planet. To put this in context, Colombia's entire gross domestic product in 1989 was roughly $39 billion. Pablo Escobar personally controlled wealth equal to nearly 65% of his country's entire economy. One man, one criminal. 2/3 of a nation's output sitting in his accounts, his warehouses, and buried in the ground across dozens of properties. The physical management of this money became one of the cartel's most serious logistical challenges. Pablo employed full teams of people whose only job was to handle cash. But even with those teams working around the clock, the volume was too great. Banknotes couldn't be counted fast enough, so they were weighed instead. Rubber bands, to bundle the bills, cost Pablo's operation over $50,000 every single month. He stored billions of dollars in warehouses, buried in fields, hidden in walls, stacked in barrels, and concealed in properties across Colombia and abroad. Every year, approximately $2 billion was simply lost, eaten by rats, destroyed by moisture, or misplaced in locations that were forgotten when the people who hid the money were killed. $2 billion gone every year, and it didn't matter. His personal spending was equally extraordinary. He owned multiple private planes and helicopters. He maintained fleets of armored vehicles. He bought buildings, apartment blocks, and entire city blocks across Colombia. His most famous property was Hacienda Nápoles, a private estate of 7,000 acres located between Medellin and Bogotá. The land alone was valued at $63 million. On it, Pablo constructed his own private airport and a separate helipad. He built 6 swimming pools, multiple soccer fields, a bullfighting arena, a tennis court, artificial lakes, and a collection of life-size dinosaur statues positioned at the entrance gate. He also built a private zoo. Not a small collection of exotic pets, a genuine zoological park stocked with elephants, lions, rhinoceroses, giraffes, zebras, hippopotamuses, camels, ostriches, and over 200 other species. Many of these animals didn't exist naturally in Colombia. Pablo had them smuggled in on his own aircraft from other continents. One night, when his young daughter was cold and couldn't sleep, Pablo Escobar gathered stacks of banknotes and set them on fire to warm her. The amount burned that night was estimated at $2 million. There is a dimension to Pablo Escobar's story that makes it impossible to understand him as simply a villain in a straightforward narrative. Because in the slums of Medellin, among the hundreds of thousands of people who had nothing, Pablo Escobar was genuinely beloved. This was not propaganda. This was not manufactured. This was real. He built entire neighborhoods, hundreds of homes constructed and handed over to families who had been living in shacks with dirt floors. He funded hospitals in communities where the government had provided none. He built schools where children had no access to education. He constructed churches, community centers, soccer fields, and public parks in the poorest parts of the city. When a local soccer team needed a new stadium, Pablo wrote the check. When a neighborhood needed a food distribution program, Pablo funded it. When families couldn't afford medicine for sick children, Pablo's people paid the bills. He was present in these communities in a way that no politician ever was. He showed up. He remembered names. He shook hands and sat down for meals in the same places where ordinary people ate. He was not performing charity from behind a desk. He was physically there, in the slums, among the people. And the people, in return, gave him something that money alone could never buy: loyalty, protection, and silence. When police came looking for Pablo, the communities he had served gave nothing away. No information, no cooperation. The people of the comunas became the most effective intelligence network Pablo ever had, not because he paid them, but because they genuinely didn't want him caught. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of Pablo Escobar's story. He was simultaneously the greatest source of terror Colombia had ever known and a genuine hero to people who had been forgotten by every system that was supposed to protect them. He understood this duality clearly. He cultivated it. He used it. And he used it to pursue the most audacious ambition of his career: entering politics. Pablo Escobar's political ambitions were not a side project. They were a calculated survival strategy. His reasoning was cold and logical. If he could achieve significant political power, if he could reach a level where he had legislative immunity, where investigations against him required political approval, where he had influence over the laws themselves, then he could never be touched. Not by Colombian courts, not by American extradition demands, not by anyone. He began building toward this goal by amplifying his public philanthropy. The housing projects, the hospitals, the schools, all of this was genuine in terms of its impact on communities. But it was also a campaign strategy. Pablo was building a voter base. He positioned himself as a reformer, a man of the people, someone who had grown up poor, who understood what poverty felt like, who wasn't going to let the elite keep stealing from the poor while pretending to govern them. The message resonated powerfully. In November 1982, Pablo Escobar was elected as an alternate member of Colombia's Chamber of Representatives, a substitute for a politician named Jairo Ortega. The world's most wanted drug trafficker now had a seat in the Colombian Congress. He attended sessions, he gave speeches, he was photographed with other legislators, with foreign dignitaries, with government officials. He traveled to Washington, D.C., and was photographed in front of the United States Capitol. He was sent to Spain as an official government representative, the same Spain where his cartel was one of the primary cocaine suppliers. Colombia's establishment was stunned, but they were also afraid, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, it appeared that Pablo Escobar might actually succeed in laundering his identity through the machinery of democratic politics. The collapse came from an unexpected direction. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla decided he had seen enough. He went public with everything: Pablo's criminal record, the drug money behind his philanthropy, the murders he had ordered, the systematic corruption he had used to build his empire. In Congress, Lara Bonilla stood up and named Pablo Escobar directly. He called him a drug trafficker and a murderer, and demanded his expulsion. The resulting scandal was impossible to survive. In January 1984, Pablo resigned his congressional seat. His political career was over. He responded the only way Pablo Escobar ever responded to opposition. In April 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was assassinated by cartel gunmen while riding in his car through Bogotá. He was 36 years old. He left behind a wife and 3 children. The editor who had published the newspaper exposés against Pablo was killed shortly after. The lesson was delivered clearly to anyone watching. Opposing Pablo Escobar meant death. No exception, no delay, no mercy. After Lara Bonilla's assassination, the Colombian government declared a state of siege and began the most aggressive law enforcement campaign in the country's history against the drug cartels. But the action that truly terrified Pablo Escobar was not the military operations or the asset seizures. It was the extradition treaty. Colombia and the United States had signed an extradition agreement that would allow Colombian criminals to be handed over to American authorities for trial. For Pablo, this was the single most dangerous thing that had ever threatened him. He had absolute confidence in his ability to manipulate the Colombian system, its judges, its politicians, its police. He had been doing it for years. But American federal prosecutors operated in a different environment entirely. They could not be bribed with Colombian pesos. American judges didn't have family members who could be threatened into compliance. The American prison system had no equivalent of La Catedral. If Pablo Escobar was ever transferred to the United States, he would spend the rest of his life in a cell, and that cell would not have a bar or a soccer field. He tried everything to prevent extradition. He offered to pay off Colombia's entire foreign debt, an offer of $10 billion if the government would tear up the extradition treaty. The government refused. So he escalated to violence on a scale that Colombia had never experienced. He created a group called Los Extraditables, the Extraditables, with a slogan that said everything. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a prison cell in the United States. In November 1985, the cartel funded a guerrilla assault on the Colombian Palace of Justice, the building housing the Supreme Court. Guerrilla fighters seized the building and took hostages. When the military retook it by force, 11 Supreme Court justices were dead. The building was partially destroyed, and the extradition treaty documents burned. Pablo's cartel planted bombs across Colombian cities: Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, Barranquilla, and dozens of smaller towns. Shopping centers, office buildings, government facilities. The bombings killed hundreds of civilians who had no connection to the drug war whatsoever. In August 1989, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán, who had vocally supported extradition and was leading in polls, was shot and killed at a campaign rally in front of thousands of supporters. 3 months later, the cartel placed a bomb on Avianca Flight 203. The plane exploded in midair. 107 people died. Pablo had believed one of his targets was on board. That target had missed the flight. 107 people died because of a scheduling mistake. Colombia was not simply experiencing crime. Colombia was at war against its own citizens, against its own institutions, against the idea that a state could function at all when one man had decided it should not. By 1991, both sides were exhausted. The Colombian government had been fighting Pablo Escobar for years and had little to show for it except mass casualties, destroyed infrastructure, and a deeply traumatized population. Pablo, for his part, had lost key allies. His cousin and right-hand man, Gustavo Gaviria, had been killed in a police raid. His cartel's second-in-command, Rodriguez Gacha, had been shot dead. Many of his most trusted associates were dead, imprisoned, or in hiding. A deal began to take shape. Colombia's new constitution, approved in 1991, prohibited the extradition of Colombian nationals. This was the single concession Pablo had been killing for. With that guarantee in place, negotiators began working toward a surrender arrangement. Pablo's terms were extraordinary. He would surrender and serve a prison sentence, but he would choose the facility. He would design it, his guards would staff it, and the 12-mile exclusion zone around the building would keep Colombian security forces at a distance. The government, desperate to end the violence, agreed. La Catedral, the cathedral, was built on a mountainside above Medellín. From the outside, it looked like a prison. High walls, guard towers, a perimeter. Inside, it was something else entirely. Pablo's personal quarters were decorated with imported furniture and thick carpets, large televisions, a full stereo system, a private library. His bedroom was larger and better furnished than most upper-middle-class homes in Bogotá. The communal areas included a fully stocked bar, a pool room, a soccer field,
and a dance floor where parties were held on weekends. Beauty queens, soccer stars, and entertainers traveled up the mountain to visit. Business meetings were conducted in conference-style rooms. Lawyers, associates, and family members came and went with minimal restriction. Most importantly, the cocaine business never stopped. Shipments were organized. Money was moved. Associates received instructions.
From his mountain palace, Pablo Escobar continued to run the most profitable criminal organization on earth. He had surrendered in name only. In every meaningful sense, he had simply relocated his headquarters. The arrangement lasted until July 1992. That month, 2 cartel members were brought to La Catedral and tortured to death inside the walls. When the government learned what had happened, they decided Pablo had to be moved to a real facility. On July 22nd, military forces arrived at La Catedral to transfer Pablo to a standard prison. He was already gone. Tipped off hours earlier by sources inside the government, Pablo had walked out of his own prison before the soldiers arrived. He was free, and Colombia plunged back into darkness. After his escape from La Catedral, Pablo Escobar became the subject of the largest manhunt in Colombian history and one of the most intensive in the world. The Colombian National Police formed a special unit called the Search Block, Bloque de Búsqueda, dedicated entirely to finding Pablo. They received assistance from the United States DEA, from CIA analysts, and from American signals intelligence units that could intercept communications and triangulate phone signals. A reward of 2.7 billion Colombian pesos was offered for information leading to Pablo's capture. The amount was staggering by Colombian standards, enough to change a family's life for generations. But finding Pablo was not a simple problem. He had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. He had safe houses across Medellin and throughout Colombia. He had a network of lookouts and informants embedded in law enforcement who kept him informed of police movements. He changed locations constantly, never sleeping in the same place twice. From the outside, the people who sheltered him were ordinary. Neighbors, shopkeepers, relatives of cartel members, people who owed favors. Inside their homes, behind false walls and under floorboards, Pablo Escobar was hiding. At the same time, a new threat emerged from within the criminal world itself. Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, was a paramilitary group formed by Pablo's enemies. It included members of the rival Cali cartel, former associates who had turned against him, relatives of people Pablo had killed, and right-wing paramilitaries who had their own reasons for wanting him dead. Los Pepes operated without restraint. They bombed properties connected to Pablo's family. They assassinated his lawyers. They killed cartel members and associates one by one, systematically dismantling his support network while he hid. Pablo was now being hunted from 2 directions simultaneously, by the combined security forces of Colombia and the United States on one side, and by a well-funded, well-armed group of personal enemies on the other. His circle of trusted people shrank week by week. Associates who had been with him for years were dead. Others had been captured. Some had simply disappeared into hiding themselves, abandoning the man who could no longer protect them. For 16 months, Pablo moved through Medellin like a ghost. He was everywhere and nowhere. The city he had once controlled with absolute authority had become his prison, the real one, the one with no pool room and no bar. December 1st, 1993, Pablo Escobar turned 44 years old. He was hiding in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin, a safe house on a quiet street that looked exactly like every other house on that street. He was with one bodyguard. His family was elsewhere, kept at a distance for their own safety. On his birthday, Pablo made a decision that every fugitive knows is dangerous. He called his family. He called his wife. He called his son, Juan Pablo. He talked for a long time, longer than he should have. He talked about missing them, about how much he loved them, about his plans for when things were different. A husband, a father. Alone in a strange house, aging, exhausted, and missing the people who were the only real anchors in his life. Colombian intelligence, assisted by American signals equipment, was listening to every word. The technology being used could triangulate a phone signal's origin by cross-referencing multiple antenna towers simultaneously. The longer Pablo stayed on the line, the more precisely the equipment could locate him. It was not an instant process. It took time to narrow down the signal to a specific block, a specific building. Pablo talked long enough. The signal was traced to a residential neighborhood called Los Olivos, a specific block, a specific house. On the morning of December 2nd, 1993, the search block moved in quietly. The neighborhood was cordoned off. Officers moved toward the building from multiple directions. When the raid began, Pablo and his bodyguard ran. They moved through the house toward the roof, hoping to find a way off the building, a way out of the block, some path that might lead to another day of survival. There was no path. Gunfire erupted. Pablo's bodyguard was killed almost immediately. Pablo kept moving, kept firing, kept searching for an exit. 3 bullets found him. One struck his leg. One struck his torso. The third and final entered behind his right ear. Pablo Escobar fell on the roof of a house in the city where he had been born into poverty, where he had built his empire, and where he had spent the last year of his life running. He was dead before he hit the ground.
When the search block confirmed Pablo Escobar was dead, the celebration was immediate and enormous. Police officers posed for photographs with the body. Commanders gave press conferences. The Colombian government declared a national victory. In Washington, D.C., officials who had spent years and hundreds of millions of dollars pursuing Pablo expressed relief. The DEA announced the conclusion of one of the most complex and dangerous investigations in the agency's history. But even in the moment of triumph, a question arose that has never been definitively answered. The bullet that killed Pablo Escobar, the one that entered behind his right ear, was fired at an angle and from a distance that some forensic analysts have described as inconsistent with a shot fired during an active chase by pursuing officers. The trajectory suggested the weapon may have been held close to Pablo's head, or even by Pablo's own hand. Pablo had talked about this many times over the years. He said it to friends, to family members, to people who worked for him. He said it so often it became part of his mythology. I will never be taken to an American prison. I will never spend my life rotting in a foreign cell. If I see that the end is coming, I will take my own life before I let them take me. His son, Juan Pablo Escobar, who later wrote about his father and changed his own name to distance himself from the legacy, has stated that he believes his father took his own life in that final moment. That the last act of Pablo Escobar was not a surrender, but a choice. the last exercise of the control that had defined his entire existence. Nobody can prove this. The Colombian government's official position is that Pablo was killed by police gunfire. The forensic evidence is inconclusive. What is certain is this: Pablo Escobar did not die in an American prison. He died in Medellin, in the city he had made his own, on his own terms, or as close to his own terms as the end of a life like his could possibly be.